The smell hit her first. Not the familiar cellar scent of damp earth and forgotten potatoes, but something else. Something metallic and sweet and wrong. It clung to the air, thick as velvet, a scent of old violence that had soaked into the very stone of the foundation. May Holloway held the oil lamp higher, its flickering light a nervous heartbeat against the oppressive dark. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight, each step a protest. Her father had never let her down here. "Nothing for you in the dark, May," he'd always said, his voice a low rumble that was meant to be comforting, but always felt like a command. He'd been dead 3 weeks now, the stroke taking him swift and silent, leaving her with a farmhouse, 40 acres of debt, and a cellar she was suddenly, terribly afraid of. The lamplight slid across damp stone walls, catching on the rust of old canning shelves and the ghostly white of spiderwebs. And then it found the chains, thick iron links, impossibly heavy, bolted directly into the far wall. They weren't for farm equipment. They were tarnished with something dark, something that wasn't rust. Her breath caught, a small, sharp sound in the profound silence. The silver wasn't just ornamental. It was wrought with concealment runes, old magic from the hunters' guilds that she recognized from her father's journals. These chains didn't just bind, they erased. To any supernatural sense, whatever was held here would simply cease to exist, a void in the fabric of the world. Her gaze followed the chains from the wall to the floor, to the shape huddled in the corner, a knot of shadows that seemed to drink the light. It was a man, or it had been. He was skeletal, folded into himself, his long, dark hair a filthy curtain hiding his face. He wore the rags of what might have been fine clothes, now shredded and stained. The manacles on his wrists and ankles glowed faintly with the suppressive magic woven through them. Blessed chains. She knew the lore. Every hunter's trial did. Her father's work wasn't a secret, just a subject of grim silence. Her father had been part of the Sanctum, a loose network of hunters who tracked and eliminated supernatural threats. But after her mother's death, killed by a rogue werewolf when May was 8, he'd grown distant from them, preferring to work alone. The other hunters respected his grief-fueled solitude. They'd stopped checking in years ago. And these chains, this setup, it was for one thing, one kind of creature. A deep, shuddering tremor went through the man on the floor, and a sound escaped him. Not a word, but a dry, rasping noise, the sound of a throat that hadn't known water in a very, very long time. His head lifted, slowly, as if the effort was monumental. The lamplight found his face, and May forgot how to breathe. It was a face of sharp, aristocratic angles, a sculpture of suffering carved from marble. But his eyes, they were ancient pits of despair, and in their depths, a faint, dying ember of red still glowed. He was a vampire, a king of shadows and blood, captured by a man who hunted monsters in the dark. She was the daughter who inherited not just his land, but his last, most terrible secret. And in the hollow space between one heartbeat and the next, she knew she was standing on the edge of a choice that would either save a life or end her own. This is the story of a reckoning ode, a debt paid in kindness instead of blood, and the quiet war fought in the heart of a forgotten farmhouse, between a woman who learned to heal and a king who learned to live. May took a step back, her heel catching on the uneven stone. The man, the vampire, flinched at the small sound, a movement so sharp it seemed to tear through his wasted frame. He pressed himself tighter against the wall, a cornered animal that had no fight left, only fear. The red in his eyes was barely there, a ghost of a threat. He was starving. Not just hungry, he was on the precipice of the true death, the final, withering end for his kind. Her father had done this, her quiet, grim father who taught her how to mend a fence and read the weather in the clouds, who smelled of sawdust and righteous certainty. He had chained a living, breathing creature in his basement and left him to desiccate in the dark. The question wasn't what he was, but why. Her father wasn't a sadist by nature. but he was absolute in his convictions. After the Blackwood Creek massacre 3 years ago, every man, woman, and child drained and left for the sun. The hunters had splintered into factions, some wanting total war, others urging restraint. Her father had withdrawn, disgusted by the politics, taking his justice into his own hands. He would have seen this not as torture, but as quarantine. Keeping a dangerous creature alive long enough to extract information about co-conspirators, about whether this was the beginning of a vampire uprising. The fact that this creature never broke, never confessed, would have only hardened her father's certainty. A guilty man would have bargained. Only the truly guilty, or the truly innocent, stayed silent unto death. "Hello?" Her voice was a whisper, swallowed by the thick, cold air. The vampire didn't answer. He didn't seem capable of it. His gaze was fixed on her, on the lamp, on the life pulsing in her throat. She could feel his focus like a physical touch, a cold pressure against her skin. It wasn't predatory, it was desperate. The look of a man dying of thirst, watching water spill onto sand. A loneliness so profound radiated from him that it made her chest ache. 3 years. 3 years of darkness and silence and the slow dissolution of self. She backed up the stairs slowly, her own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't run. Running felt like an insult to the profound stillness of his suffering. At the top of the stairs, she closed the heavy wooden door, the latch falling into place with a solid thud that felt like a judgment. She leaned against it, the rough wood cool against her cheek, and listened. There was no sound. Only the memory of those eyes that had seen her not as an enemy, but as the first living thing in 1,000 days of dying alone. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, moving through the familiar rooms of the farmhouse like a ghost. The house was filled with her father, his worn armchair, the scent of his pipe tobacco still lingering in the curtains, his scuffed boots by the door. She saw it all through new eyes now. What other secrets did this house hold? What other darkness had he brought across this threshold? By nightfall, she had made a decision. It wasn't born of courage, or even pity, but of a simple, gut-wrenching certainty. She could not be the person who let someone starve to death, not even a monster. Especially not a monster her own father had caged. The loneliness in those red eyes had mirrored something in her own soul, the isolation of being the only one left, the only one who knew, the only one who could choose differently. She went to the shed and found the hunting knife her father kept for skinning deer. Then she walked to the chicken coop. The hens murmured and shifted as she entered, their small, beady eyes watching her. She chose one, and the act was swift and ugly, but her hand was steady. In the kitchen, she drained the blood into a clean glass jar, her stomach churning. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When she descended the cellar stairs for the second time, the scene was unchanged. The vampire was in the same position, as if he hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't even blinked. He was conserving every last shred of energy, holding on to existence by the thinnest of threads. "I brought you something." She kept her voice low, calm. She set the lamp down on a crate a safe distance away and approached him slowly, holding out the jar. It's not what you're used to, I'm sure, but it's all I have." He stared at the jar, then at her. A flicker of something, confusion, disbelief, a desperate hope so fragile it threatened to shatter, passed through his eyes. He didn't move. The chains clinked softly with the faint tremor that still racked his body. "You have to drink it," she said, her voice still quiet. I'm not going to hurt you." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air between them. He was a vampire king, and she was a mortal woman with a jar of chicken blood, promising not to hurt him. But in this moment, in this place, the power dynamic was grotesquely inverted. She knelt, placing the jar on the floor just outside the reach of his chains. It was a test, a risk. If he had any strength left, he could lunge and she would be too close. But his stillness was absolute. He watched the jar, his dark eyes wide, and she saw in them the war being waged, the animal instinct to survive battling against a pride that had been shattered into dust, against a dignity that 3 years of abandonment had stripped away piece by piece. May retreated a few steps, giving him space. She sat on the bottom stair, her knees drawn up to her chest, and waited. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The only sounds were her own breathing and the frantic flutter of the lamp's flame. Minutes passed. 10. 20. She began to think he would refuse, that he would choose death over the indignity of this. Then, with a movement so slow it was almost imperceptible, he began to move. He uncurled himself, inch by agonizing inch. The chains scraped against the stone, a sound that set her teeth on edge. He crawled forward, his limbs trembling violently. It was a terrible, desperate pilgrimage of a few feet, and watching it broke something inside her. This was what her father had reduced a king to. When he finally reached the jar, his hands shook so badly he could barely grasp it. He lifted it to his lips, his throat working convulsively as he drank. He drained the jar in seconds. The small amount of blood was a pittance, a single drop of rain on a parched desert, but it was something. When he was done, the jar slipped from his fingers and rolled across the floor with a hollow clatter. He collapsed back onto the stone, his breathing a series of harsh, ragged gasps. The ember in his eyes burned a fraction brighter. It was the first victory. A small, terrifying, and necessary one. He looked at her, and for the first time, she didn't just see a monster. She saw a survivor. She saw herself, alone, forgotten, holding on because surrender meant erasure. She did it again the next night, and the night after that. A ritual of blood and silence. She never spoke more than a few words. He never made a sound. She would bring the jar, set it down, and retreat to the stairs to watch him drink. Each time he moved a little easier, the tremors lessened. The light in his eyes grew from a dying ember to a steady, watchful coal. After a week, she graduated from chickens to rabbits she caught in snares. The blood was richer, and the effect was more noticeable. A subtle shift in the hollows of his cheeks, a sharpening of his gaze. He started watching her with an unnerving intensity, tracking her every movement. He was still weak, still chained, but the mind behind those eyes was coming back to life. He was assessing her, studying her, and she had no idea what he saw. But she felt it, the weight of his attention, the way he seemed to memorize the cadence of her footsteps, the way she moved, the sound of her voice when she spoke. It was as if he were gathering pieces of her, holding them close in the darkness like treasures. One night, after he had finished the jar, he didn't collapse. He remained on his hands and knees, his head bowed. The silence stretched, but this time it felt different. It was charged with unspoken words, with a need that had been building between them like a tide. When he finally looked up, his voice was a dry rasp, the sound of vocal cords shaping their first word in years. Why? The single word was a thunderclap in the quiet cellar. May's heart jumped. She hadn't realized how accustomed she'd grown to their silence, how the sound of his voice, rough and broken as it was, could affect her so profoundly. "You were starving," she answered simply, as if it were the most obvious reason in the world. He stared at her, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. It wasn't gratitude. It was closer to suspicion, to a profound and weary confusion, to the bewilderment of a man who had forgotten what kindness looked like. "He left me to die," he rasped, the words costing him a visible effort. He meant her father. "I know," she said softly. "I'm not him." His eyes held hers for a long moment, and in their depths she saw centuries of power, of pride, of pain. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. Not as a source of blood, not as the daughter of his jailer, but as something else entirely, something he couldn't yet understand. a human who looked at a monster and chose mercy. A woman who heard the answer why and gave him the only truth that mattered. Because she could not be the person who walked away. He gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, and then retreated back to his corner, wrapping the shadows around himself like a shroud. But the silence was broken now. The first stone had been thrown into the still pool of their strange coexistence, and the ripples were just beginning to spread. The question hung between them for days, an invisible barrier and a bridge all at once. He didn't speak again, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty, it was full of that single, unanswered word, full of the things neither of them knew how to say. Why? May didn't have a better answer than the one she'd given. She wasn't her father. It was a simple truth, but it felt like the foundation of everything she was doing. Her father was a man of black and white, of absolute conviction. He saw a monster, and he acted. May saw a creature in pain, and she could not turn away. It was a weakness, he would have called it, a fatal flaw. But in the quiet hours of the night, when she lay in her bed and thought of the vampire in the cellar, she wondered if maybe it was the opposite. Maybe seeing the person inside the monster was the only strength that mattered. She started bringing a stool down with her, sitting just beyond his reach while he drank. She would talk to him, her voice quiet and even, filling the oppressive silence with the mundane details of her day. She told him about the leaky roof, the fox that was stalking the remaining chickens, the price of feed in town. She didn't expect a response. It was more for her own benefit at first, to normalize the surreal reality of keeping a vampire king in her basement. It made him seem less like a mythical beast and more like a patient. But as the nights passed, she realized it was for him, too. He listened. She could tell by the way his head was angled toward her, the stillness in his body, the way his eyes never left her face. He absorbed her words like the dry earth absorbed rain. He had been alone with nothing but pain and silence for 3 years. The sound of a human voice speaking of ordinary things, of weather and animals and the small struggles of daily life, was a lifeline. It was proof that the world still turned, that life still existed beyond the 4 walls of his tomb. She saw the hunger in him shift. It was no longer just for blood. It was for connection, for the simple presence of another living soul. And God help her, she felt it too. The farmhouse had been so empty since her father died, so full of echoes and grief. But now, in the strangest way, she wasn't alone anymore. One evening, about a month after she found him, she brought him a bowl of venison blood, procured from a hunter in the next town over who owed her father a favor. It was the most potent source she'd managed yet. He drank it slowly, deliberately, and she could see the life flowing back into him in real time. The sallow, grayish tint of his skin was receding, replaced by a pale luminescence that seemed to glow in the lamplight. The sharp bones of his face were softening as muscle and tissue began to regenerate. He was still thin, still a shadow of what he must have been, but the shape of the king was beginning to re-emerge from the ruins. When he finished, he set the bowl down carefully. He looked at his hands, turning them over, flexing his fingers as if reacquainting himself with them. The silver-etched manacles seemed to hum with a faint, suppressive energy, but even through their power, she could feel the change in him. He was no longer on the edge of dissolution. He was coming back. "My name is Ezra," he said. His voice was stronger now, a low baritone that resonated in the small space, though it still held a rough, unused edge. May's breath hitched. It was the first piece of himself he had offered, and the intimacy of it struck her like a physical blow. A name. An identity. He was no longer just the vampire in the cellar. He was Ezra. "I'm May," she said, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I know," he said, his gaze lifting to meet hers, and the intensity in his red eyes made her pulse quicken. "May Holloway. Your father was a thorough man. He enjoyed telling me who he was, and whose daughter would one day find my dust." The words were delivered without heat, a simple statement of fact, but they sent a chill down her spine. The cruelty of it. Her father had not just left him to die, but had taunted him with the future, with the image of a life that would go on without him, with the knowledge that she would be the one to discover his remains. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling pitifully inadequate for the enormity of what her father had done. Ezra inclined his head. "You have nothing to be sorry for. You are not your father's keeper." He paused, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, seen in a way she hadn't been in years. Nor his reflection. They sat in silence for a time, the air thick with the ghosts of her father's actions. May felt a wave of shame so profound it was nauseating. She had loved her father, had respected his strength and his quiet certainty, but she could not reconcile the man who taught her to set a bird's broken wing with the man who would do this, who would take another being, monster or not, and break them slowly, deliberately, over the course of 3 years. "Why did he take you?" she asked, the question she had been afraid to voice, the one that kept her awake at night. "What did he think you did?" Ezra's expression tightened. A shadow passed through his eyes, so dark and cold it seemed to lower the temperature in the cellar. The pain there was visceral, and she found herself leaning forward, wanting to ease it somehow, this agony that had been his only companion for so long. "He accused me of slaughtering a human village, Blackwood Creek. Every man, woman, and child, drained and left for the sun." May felt the blood drain from her own face. She remembered the stories. A gruesome attack 3 years ago that had sent a shockwave of fear through the human settlements. It was the event that had galvanized the hunters, her father included, that had turned whispers of war into shouts. "He said he found my signet ring in the ashes of the town's chapel," Ezra continued, his voice flat, and she heard in it the exhaustion of a man who had told this story 1,000 times to ears that would not listen. "He demanded to know why, who I was working with. He believed it was the opening move in a new war against humanity, but I had no answers to give him, not the ones he wanted." "And was it?" May asked, her voice barely a whisper, because she needed to know, needed to hear him say it. "Did you do it?" Ezra looked at her, his gaze unwavering, and she saw in his eyes a naked honesty that made her chest tighten. "I have not set foot in the mortal world for over a century. I was in the Shadowwood, mediating a territorial dispute between 2 clans, a week's ride from Blackwood Creek. Someone planted that ring. Someone wanted me gone." He exhaled, a long, slow breath that sounded like grinding stones. "Your father. He did not believe in nuance. He saw a ring, and he saw a culprit. He would not listen to anything else. For 3 years I told him the truth. For 3 years he called me a liar and left me to rot." May believed him. It wasn't just the conviction in his voice, it was the sheer, exhaustive pain in his eyes. This was not the anger of a guilty man. It was the deep, soul-crushing weariness of an innocent one who had screamed his truth into a void for 3 years and had been answered only with silence and starvation. It was the loneliness of being the only one who knew your own innocence and having it matter to no one. "My brother Theron would have searched for me," Ezra said quietly, and for the first time she heard something other than despair in his voice. It was a fragile, aching hope. "He would have torn the world apart looking for me. But these chains—" He lifted his wrists, the silver runes glowing faintly. "They don't just bind, they erase. To any supernatural sense, I simply ceased to exist. A void. Theron would have felt me disappear from his mind, from the world, as if I had been wiped from existence. He would have searched for months, maybe years. But how do you find a ghost? How do you mourn someone who leaves no trace?" His voice broke on the last word, and May saw tears, actual tears, well in his ancient eyes. "He thinks I'm dead. He's been ruling in my place, carrying the weight of a crown he never wanted, grieving a brother he believes lost forever. And I couldn't reach him. I couldn't tell him I was still here, still fighting to survive. The chains severed everything: my power, my connection to my people, even the bond between us. I have been more alone than I ever thought possible. The raw vulnerability in his confession shattered the last of May's defenses. She stood from her stool and crossed the space between them, kneeling just outside the reach of his chains. Close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his red eyes, close enough that his cold presence washed over her like a winter wind. "You're not alone anymore," she said, and the words were a vow. "I see you, Ezra. I see you." He stared at her, and something shifted in his expression. The walls he had built to survive the isolation began to crumble. "Why?" he asked again, but this time it wasn't a question of suspicion. It was a plea. A desperate need to understand how, in a world that had tried to erase him, she could look at him and choose to stay. "Because loneliness recognizes loneliness," she said simply. "Because I know what it's like to be the only one left. Because when I look at you, I don't see a monster. I see someone who's been surviving alone for too long, just like me." A sound escaped him, something between a laugh and a sob, raw and broken. "May," he whispered, and the way he said her name, like a prayer, like a lifeline, made her heart clench. From that night on, their conversations deepened, became the heartbeat of her days. He told her of his kingdom, a realm of ancient castles and perpetual twilight, of complex politics and immortal feuds. But more than that, he told her of the small things, the way the moon looked over the shadow wood, the sound of his brother's laugh, the weight of a crown that was both honor and prison. He spoke of his life with a detached, sorrowful air, as if describing a book he had once read, as if his past were a story that belonged to someone else. His former life felt impossibly distant to him now, a dream from which he had violently awakened into this new reality of stone and chains and the presence of a woman who was teaching him what it meant to be seen again. She, in turn, told him about her life, about her mother's death when she was young, about her quiet, lonely upbringing on this farm with a father who loved her but could never truly reach her, about her dream of being a botanist, of studying the secret lives of plants, a dream she had set aside to help her father, because duty was what Holloways did. She confessed her fears about the debt hanging over the farm, about losing the only home she had ever known, about the terrifying prospect of being utterly alone in the world. And as she spoke, she saw him absorb her words, saw him hold her stories as carefully as she held his. In that damp, cold cellar, surrounded by the evidence of her father's cruelty and the chains that bound him, two lonely souls began to build a fragile bridge of understanding. He was a king who had lost his kingdom, and she was a woman tethered to a legacy she didn't want. He was her prisoner, but in a strange, inexplicable way, she was his too. They were both trapped by the actions of a dead man, both trying to survive in the aftermath of his choices. But in each other, they found something neither had expected: a mirror. Someone who understood the particular ache of being left behind. One evening, she found the key. It was in her father's roll-top desk, tucked inside a hollowed-out book on agricultural pest control, hidden away like the shameful secret it was. A single, heavy iron key, cold to the touch. She knew instantly what it was for. Her heart began to race, her hands trembling as she held it up to the lamplight. This small piece of metal was the difference between captivity and freedom, between the dying creature in the cellar and the king he had once been. She carried it down to the cellar that night, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Ezra was waiting, watching her as she descended the stairs, his eyes immediately fixed on the key in her hand, and she saw his entire body go rigid. He said nothing, but she could feel the sudden tension radiating from him, the hope and fear warring in his expression. He was stronger now, not fully recovered, but the feral weakness was long gone. If she unlocked him, she was removing the only thing that kept her safe. She was placing her life entirely in his hands. She was trusting a vampire, a predator, with her life. And she was doing it willingly. She stopped in front of him, just out of reach. "I found this," she said, holding up the key. And her voice shook, despite her attempt at steadiness. His gaze was intense, searching, boring into her with an expression so complex she couldn't begin to parse it. He didn't look at the key, he looked at her, only at her. "What do you intend to do with it?" His voice was soft, but she heard the current of emotion beneath it. Anticipation, fear, something that sounded dangerously close to hope. I can't leave you chained up like an animal," she said, her voice shaking more now. "It's wrong. What my father did was wrong, and I won't be complicit in it any more." "Your father thought it was right," he pointed out, his voice a soft, dangerous rumble that made her pulse skip. "He thought me a monster who deserved no better. What if he was right, May? What if the moment these chains fall, I tear out your throat for the inconvenience of the last 3 years? What if the first thing I do with my freedom is kill the woman who gave it to me?" The threat was there, a coiled serpent in his words, but she didn't believe it. She had spent weeks with him, had seen the profound grief and weary honor in his eyes, had felt the gentleness with which he treated their fragile connection. He was testing her, she realized. Testing her faith in him, her belief in what she saw when she looked at him. "Then I guess you'll have your revenge," she said, her voice evening out, finding a strange calm in the face of the monumental risk she was about to take. "But I don't think you will." She saw something flash through his eyes, surprise, awe, and something deeper, something that looked like the beginning of devotion. She stepped forward, into his space, into his reach. Close enough that she could feel the cold emanating from his body, close enough that if he wanted to hurt her, nothing could stop him. Her hands trembled as she fit the key into the lock on his right wrist. The air was thick with tension, with the scent of old blood and damp earth and something else. The clean, cold scent of his skin, like winter and stone and ancient forests. He didn't move a muscle. He simply watched her, his breath held, and she could feel the weight of this moment pressing down on both of them. 3 years of captivity ending with the turn of a key. 3 years of suffering being entrusted to the hands of his jailer's daughter. The lock was stiff. She had to put her weight into it, turning the key until it gave with a loud, grating click that echoed through the cellar like a gunshot. The heavy manacle sprang open. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, as if in a dream, Ezra pulled his arm free. He looked at his wrist, at the raw, chafed skin marked by years of silver burning against flesh, at the freedom he hadn't known in 1,000 days. His hand was shaking. He lifted his hand, and May's breath caught as his long, pale fingers brushed against her cheek. His touch was feather-light, shockingly cold, and it sent a jolt through her entire body that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the profound intimacy of the gesture. It was not a violent touch. It was one of wonder, of awe, of a man touching something precious and fearing it might shatter. A look of profound, heart-wrenching gratitude filled his eyes. Gratitude and something else, something fiercer and more desperate. In that moment, May knew she had been right to trust him. She also knew that something between them had fundamentally shifted. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. He held her gaze, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her throat tighten. And she saw in his eyes everything he couldn't yet say. The devotion, the need, the beginning of something that terrified them both. "No," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, rough with feeling. "I will not. I will never hurt you, May. Never." It was a vow, spoken with the weight of centuries behind it. He lowered his hand and held out his other wrist, and then his ankles, waiting patiently as she unlocked the rest of his chains. When the last one fell away, clattering onto the stone floor with a sound of finality, he rose to his feet. He was tall, so much taller than she had realized. Even emaciated, even still marked by his ordeal, he possessed an innate grace, a power that seemed to emanate from him, filling the cellar with a presence that was both terrifying and magnificent. He was a king, chained or not. He took a step, then another, testing his legs. They held. He was free. And in the flickering lamplight, standing in the cellar that had been his prison, he looked at the woman who had unchained him, and he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that he owed her a debt that could never be fully repaid. More than that, he knew that she had become essential to him in a way that transcended debt, that went beyond gratitude into territory far more dangerous. She had not just saved his life. She had reminded him what it meant to be alive. Freedom was not a sudden flood of relief, but a slow, disorienting tide. For 3 years, Ezra's world had been a 10 by 10 foot square of cold stone. Now the cellar itself felt vast, the house above an impossible universe. May led him up the creaking stairs, one slow step at a time. His legs were unsteady, his body still remembering the phantom weight of the chains, still adjusting to the concept of movement without restriction. When he emerged into the farmhouse kitchen, he stopped, his hand bracing against the doorframe as if the sight before him was too much to process. The moonlight streaming through the window was an assault on senses dulled by endless darkness. He hadn't seen the moon in 1,000 nights. He stared at it, a perfect silver disk in a sea of indigo, and a pain deeper than any physical torture lanced through him. He had missed so much, so many turnings of the world, so many nights of beauty he would never get back. May didn't rush him. She stood by the counter, giving him space, watching him with a quiet, worried intensity that he could feel like a physical touch. The house was small, cluttered with the simple artifacts of a human life, a stack of mail on the table, a chipped mug by the sink, a faded photograph of a woman with May's smile. It was all so fragile, so temporary. It terrified him more than the blessed chains ever had, because it was real and it was hers and he wanted desperately to be part of it. "You can have my father's room," she said softly. Ezra tore his gaze from the window. The thought of sleeping in his tormentor's bed was repulsive, but he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she was swaying slightly on her feet. She was taking care of him, running herself ragged to keep him fed and safe, and she was likely running on fumes herself. He gave a slight nod. "Thank you." The room was sparse, clean. A simple wooden bed, a dresser, a window that looked out over the dark, sleeping fields. The scent of her father was here, faint but present. Sawdust, pipe tobacco, and the cold metallic smell of conviction. Ezra stood in the center of the room, feeling utterly displaced. He was a king without a throne, a creature of the night blinking in the sudden terrifying light of kindness. May brought him a set of her father's old clothes. They hung on his gaunt frame, but they were clean and soft and smelled of lavender soap instead of blood and stone. She also brought him a glass of water. He took it, the simple human gesture feeling strangely intimate, and when their fingers brushed, the brief contact was like a spark of lightning. He saw her flinch, a barely perceptible recoil, and he understood. He was still a monster in her house, no matter how gently she treated him. "You are not safe with me," he said, his voice low, and he needed her to understand the risk she was taking, needed her to know that the hunger was a constant, low hum beneath his skin. The blood she provided kept it at bay, but it was always there. He was a predator, and she was everything that was warm and alive and precious. "I know," she said, her gaze steady, and he saw no fear in her eyes, only a bone-deep tiredness and something else, a determination that matched his own. "But I was less safe when you were chained in the basement, starving. A desperate creature is more dangerous than a controlled one." He had no answer to that. She was right. He had been closer to losing himself down there than he had ever been in his long life. Her pragmatism was as surprising as her compassion, and it made him want to protect her all the more fiercely. The next few weeks were a period of careful adjustment, of learning how to exist in the same space, of building something fragile and precious between them. Ezra spent most of his time indoors, regaining his strength. The sunlight was a physical pain that drove him into the darkest corners of the house, and his body needed time to heal from the prolonged starvation and the suppressive effects of the silver. He slept during the day, true, deep sleeps that were blessedly free of the nightmares that had plagued him in the cellar. At night, he would wander the quiet rooms of the farmhouse, a ghost, relearning the dimensions of the world. But mostly, he watched May. He watched her tend her garden by moonlight, her hands gentle as she coaxed life from the soil, her face soft with concentration. He watched her pay bills at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed with worry as she calculated and recalculated, trying to make the numbers work. He saw the strength in her, a resilience that ran deeper than bone, a quiet determination that reminded him of the ancient oaks in his homeland, rooted, enduring, capable of weathering any storm. She carried her grief for her father and the weight of his legacy with a grace that humbled him. She never spoke of what he'd done with accusation or bitterness. She simply lived with the consequences, as did Ezra. And in her acceptance of that burden, he found a kind of absolution he hadn't known he needed. They fell into a routine that felt almost domestic, almost normal, if one ignored the fundamental impossibility of it. She would leave a jar of animal blood for him in the icebox before she went to bed, and he would find it there like a gift, like proof that she was thinking of him even in her sleep. They would talk in the evenings, their conversations weaving a tapestry of two worlds, his of shadow and eternity, hers of sunlight and seasons. He told her of the intricate dance of vampire politics, of the old laws that governed their kind, of the beauty of his shadowed kingdom where the moon never set and the stars sang in languages older than human memory. She described the changing of the seasons, the taste of a sun-warmed tomato, the feeling of rain on her skin, the way the light looked when it filtered through new leaves in spring. He drank in her descriptions of the mortal world, a world he had long ago dismissed as fleeting and insignificant. Through her eyes, he saw its beauty, its terrible fragility, the poignant sweetness of things that did not last forever. One night, she found him in the living room, staring at the empty fireplace, with an expression of such profound longing that it made her chest ache. "You're thinking of home," she said. It wasn't a question. She had come to know the cadences of his moods, could read the subtle shifts in his expression. "I am," he admitted, and his voice was thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "My brother, Theron, he believes me dead. He will be ruling in my place, carrying a crown he never wanted, mourning a loss he thinks is permanent." "Is he a good ruler?" she asked, sitting in the armchair opposite him. And he turned to look at her with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of complicated love. "Theron has a good heart, but he is softer than I am. He rules with sentiment, not strategy. My court will see it as weakness. There will be those who seek to take advantage of his grief." He looked at her, his expression grim and troubled. "My kingdom is likely in turmoil. It needs its king. It needs someone who can be ruthless when necessary, who understands the balance of power and fear that keeps our world from descending into chaos." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. The unspoken next step. He had to go back. Now that he was stronger, it was his duty. The realization landed in May's chest with a surprising weight, a hollow ache that spread through her like ice water. She had grown used to his presence, to their quiet evenings, to the strange, protective energy he brought to the lonely farmhouse. The thought of him leaving, of these rooms being empty again, of returning to the solitude that had defined her life before him, it left a hollow space inside her that felt dangerously close to heartbreak. "When will you go?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral, but he heard the tremor beneath it, the pain she was trying to hide. "Soon," he said, and the word felt like a door closing. "I am almost at my full strength. But I cannot go back as I am. I need to send a message first, to prepare the way. My reappearance will cause chaos, joy and terror in equal measure. I need allies who will stand with me when I return, who can help me stabilize the court before my enemies have time to react." "How will you do that from here?" He smiled, a faint, sad curving of his lips. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it transformed his face, chasing away some of the ancient sorrow and revealing the man he must have been before captivity broke him. It made her heart stutter. We have our ways. There are lines of communication that your world has never dreamed of. But I will need your help. The request thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. She was being drawn deeper into his world, into the shadows where she didn't belong, but she couldn't imagine saying no. Anything, she said, without hesitation, and meant it with every fiber of her being. His plan was simple yet elegant. There was a coven loyal to him in the city, 2 hours away. He gave her the name of a bookstore, the Gilded Page, and the name of its proprietor, a vampire named Corvus who had served his family for 3 centuries. He also gave her a message, a single phrase in their ancient tongue that she practiced until her pronunciation was perfect, until he closed his eyes and smiled at the sound of his language on her human lips. I can't give you my ring, he said with frustration. Your father kept it as evidence. It would be in his things somewhere. They searched the house together, moving through her father's possessions with a strange mixture of reverence and violation. Finally, in a locked drawer in his desk, they found it. A heavy signet ring of dark metal, etched with symbols that seemed to writhe in the lamplight. Ezra took it with shaking hands, staring at it as if it were a piece of his soul returned. Give him the ring, Ezra instructed, his voice thick, and say the words, "The sun has set, but the moon remains." He will know what it means. He will know that I am alive. The next day, May drove her father's old pickup truck into the city, the ring heavy in her pocket like a secret, like a promise. The bookstore was tucked away on a narrow cobblestoned street, a relic of a bygone era that seemed to exist outside of time. A small bell chimed as she entered. The air inside smelled of old paper, leather, and dust, and something else. Something cold and ancient that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. A tall, elegant man with silver-streaked hair and eyes the color of twilight looked up from behind the counter. Corvus. Even without Ezra's description, she would have known him for what he was. The stillness, the ageless quality of his features. Can I help you? He asked, his voice smooth as aged velvet, polite but distant. May's heart pounded, but she kept her composure. She had come too far to falter now. She walked to the counter and placed the signet ring on the polished wood with a soft click that seemed to echo through the quiet shop. The vampire's eyes widened, his professional calm shattering like glass. He stared at the ring, then at her, his gaze sharp and disbelieving, and she saw in his face the same desperate hope she had seen in Ezra's eyes that first night. The sun has set, but the moon remains, she said, her voice clear and steady, and she watched as the words hit him like a physical blow. Corvus went utterly still, so still that he didn't even seem to breathe. He picked up the ring with trembling fingers, tracing the familiar crest, and a storm of emotions passed over his face. Shock, grief, and then a dawning, ferocious hope that transformed his features. Where is he? He breathed, his eyes boring into hers with an intensity that would have frightened her weeks ago. But she had lived with a vampire, had earned his trust and given her own, and she met Corvus's gaze without flinching. He's safe, May said. He's healing. He sent me to tell his allies that he will be returning soon, that the king they thought lost is coming home. Corvus nodded, his mind clearly racing through implications and strategies. It will be done. Forces will be marshaled. The court is a viper's nest under Theron's gentle hand. Those who have gained power in Ezra's absence will not relinquish it easily. His return must be handled with precision, with overwhelming force, or they will try to kill him the moment he appears. He looked at her, his ancient eyes filled with a new, profound respect. You are the human who found him. He must trust you a great deal to send you here, to place the proof of his survival in your hands. He had no one else, she said simply, though the words felt inadequate for the complexity of what had grown between them. Perhaps, Corvus mused, his gaze too knowing, too perceptive. Or perhaps he has found the only one he needs. The drive back to the farmhouse was filled with a sense of impending change, of doors closing and others opening, of the quiet interlude ending and the real world rushing back in. When she got back, Ezra was waiting for her on the porch. It was just after sunset, and he stood in the twilight, looking out over the fields with his hands braced on the railing. He looked stronger, more solid, more like the king he had once been, and less like the broken creature she had found. The transformation was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "It is done," she said, walking up the steps, and he turned to her with an expression that stole her breath. He crossed to her in 2 strides and took her hand, his cold fingers wrapping around hers. The gesture was no longer tentative. It was firm, possessive, and deeply grateful. "Thank you, May," he said, his voice low and intense. "You have risked everything for me. You have given me back not just my life, but my kingdom, my brother, my future. I can never repay this debt." "You would have done the same," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't sure they were true. "No," he said, his voice quiet but fierce, and his grip on her hand tightened. "I would not have. Before this, before you, I would have seen you as nothing more than a means to an end, a tool to be used and discarded. You have taught me something else." He didn't name it. He didn't have the words for it yet, or perhaps he did but was afraid to speak them aloud. But it was there, a powerful, unspoken current flowing between them in the gathering dark, in the way he looked at her as if she were the only real thing in a world of shadows. He was leaving soon. They both knew it, and the thought of it was becoming more unbearable with each passing night, each shared silence, each accidental touch that lingered longer than it should. The waiting was a unique form of torment, a slow countdown to an ending neither of them wanted, but both knew was inevitable. For weeks, the farmhouse had been a sanctuary, a world unto itself. Now it felt like a temporary outpost, a fragile bubble of peace about to be burst by the encroaching reality of Ezra's other life. Every night the tension grew, thick and electric in the air between them. He was restless, pacing the confines of the house like a caged panther, his body humming with an energy that seemed barely contained. His strength had returned completely, a potent, dangerous vitality that seemed to crackle in the air around him. He was no longer the broken creature from the cellar. He was every inch the immortal king, and the quiet, domestic world they had built felt too small to contain him, too fragile to hold the magnitude of what he was. May found herself watching him constantly, cataloging the changes, memorizing the way he moved. The way he moved with a silent, fluid grace that was both beautiful and predatory. The way his eyes, now a constant deep crimson, missed nothing. Every detail, every nuance registered and assessed. The power that radiated from him was a palpable force, and sometimes, late at night, when she watched him standing at her window looking at the moon, it frightened her. Not because she thought he would hurt her, but because she understood now the true scope of what he was. He was a creature of darkness and power and immortal strength, and she was a woman of soil and sunlight and brief, fragile mortality. The chasm between their worlds felt wider than ever, an unbridgeable gulf that she had been foolish to forget. Their conversations changed, too. He spoke more of his plans, of the political maneuverings he would need to reclaim his throne. He talked of Theron, his brother, with a complex mix of affection and frustration and guilt that made her heart ache for him. "Theron sees the throne as a burden," Ezra explained one evening, as they sat on the porch swing, the chain creaking a rhythmic, lonely tune that seemed to echo the beating of her heart. "I see it as a responsibility. He will be relieved to give it up, but his pride will be wounded. He'll feel as though he failed somehow, as though his rule was just keeping the seat warm for my return. And those who have gained power under his reign will not relinquish it easily. They will fight me. There will be challenges, duels, perhaps even open rebellion. Will you have to hurt him? May asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. The fear of what he would have to become to reclaim what was his. Ezra turned to look at her, his expression serious in the pale moonlight, and she saw the shadow of the ruthless king he would need to be. I will never harm my brother. He is the only family I have left, the only connection to who I was before all of this. But I will have to be ruthless with those who have used his grief to poison our court. There will be a reckoning. Blood will be shed. It is the only language some of them understand, the only way to establish dominance and restore order. His words painted a picture of a brutal, violent world, so far removed from the quiet peace of her farm that it felt like a fairy tale, dark and ancient and steeped in blood. She tried to imagine him there, a king dispensing judgment, his hands stained with the necessary violence of maintaining power. And the image warred with the man who listened so patiently as she described the different types of soil in her garden. The man whose eyes softened when her cat curled up on his lap. The man who had wept when she unchained him. How could he be both? How could she reconcile these two versions of Ezra, the gentle companion and the ruthless king? One night, a black carriage, drawn by two horses that seemed to be carved from shadow itself, their eyes glowing with an unnatural red light, arrived at the end of the long dirt drive. It came without a sound, simply appearing in the twilight as if it had materialized from the evening mist, from the spaces between worlds. Corvus stepped out, dressed in immaculate black that seemed to absorb light, and with him came the undeniable weight of reality crashing back in. It was time. The finality of it was a physical blow that drove the air from May's lungs. May stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself as if she could hold herself together through sheer force of will, as Ezra prepared to leave. He was dressed in fine, dark clothes that Corvus had brought, clothes that fit him perfectly and transformed him back into the aristocrat he was, a king in exile returning to reclaim his throne. The farmer's daughter and the vampire king. They had never looked more different, never been more aware of the impossible distance between their worlds. He came to stand before her on the porch, and he didn't speak for a long moment. He simply looked at her, his gaze memorizing her face as if he were trying to burn the image into his immortal memory, as if he feared forgetting what she looked like in the soft twilight. I owe you a debt that can never be repaid, he said finally, his voice low and thick with emotion that made it rough, almost breaking. You saved my life. You gave me back my sanity. You showed me kindness when you had every reason to walk away, when anyone else would have left me to the darkness I deserved. You don't owe me anything, Ezra, she said, her own voice unsteady, and she meant it even though her heart was breaking. I did what was right. What was right for you was a death sentence for most, he countered gently, and his hand came up to cup her face, his cold palm against her warm cheek. You looked at a monster and saw a man. You unchained a predator and trusted him not to harm you. You gave me hope when I had forgotten what it felt like. That is not nothing, May. That is everything. His thumb stroked her cheekbone, the gesture achingly familiar now. Something that had become theirs in the quiet nights of the farmhouse. When I have reclaimed my throne, when my kingdom is secure and the chaos has settled, I will send for you, he said. And the words were a promise, but they sounded like a farewell, like something fragile being offered with no certainty it would be accepted. A king sending for a human. What would she be in his world? A pet? A curiosity? The mortal who had found their king in a basement and given him back his crown? The thought was unbearable. The idea of being something owned, displayed, reduced to a footnote in his story. This is my home, Ezra, she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by the fear of losing herself entirely. I belong here, in the sunlight, in the soil. This is who I am. A look of pain crossed his face, so raw and deep that she almost took the words back. I know, he said, and his voice was rough with feeling. But he struggled for the words, his immortal composure cracking, revealing the desperate need beneath. I do not wish to belong there without you. I have spent 300 years ruling a kingdom, and I never once felt at home in it. But here, in this small house with its leaking roof and its debts, with you, this is the first place I have ever felt like I could stay. Like I could be something other than a king, like I could just be Ezra. It was the closest he had ever come to a confession, and it shattered the last of her defenses, broke down the walls she had been trying to maintain around her heart. Before she could think, before she could stop herself or consider the impossibility of what she was doing, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was a collision of worlds, of mortality and eternity meeting in a single desperate moment. His lips were impossibly cold, the shock of it stealing her breath, but it was instantly overwhelmed by the raw, desperate emotion behind the kiss. He froze for a second, surprised, as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening, and then his arms came around her, pulling her tight against him with a strength that would have frightened her if it hadn't felt so much like coming home. He kissed her back with a fierce, possessive hunger that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with a soul-starved loneliness that matched her own. It was a kiss of gratitude and desperation, and 1,000 unspeakable things that had grown between them in the silence of the farmhouse. Need and devotion, and the terrifying, exhilarating discovery of not being alone anymore. It was the acknowledgement of what they had both been trying to deny, the truth that had been building between them since the moment she unchained him, maybe since the moment she first brought him blood and chose mercy over fear. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, and she could feel the tremor that ran through his body. "May," he whispered, his voice ragged, broken open with feeling. The sound of her name was a prayer, a plea, a promise. "Be safe," she said, her hands gripping the front of his fine coat, holding on to him as if she could keep him here through will alone. "Come back to me." "I will come back," he vowed, and it was not a king's promise, spoken with political calculation and careful diplomacy. It was a man's promise, raw and desperate and utterly sincere. "I will come back for you. I swear it on everything I am, on every year I have lived and every year I have yet to live. I will come back." He kissed her one last time, a brief, hard press of his lips that tasted like goodbye and forever all at once. And then he turned and walked to the carriage without looking back. She knew if he looked back, he might not be able to leave, might not be able to do what duty demanded. She stood on the porch and watched as the carriage of shadows dissolved into the night, taking him away from her, and she was left alone in the sudden, deafening silence. The farmhouse, which had been her sanctuary, now felt impossibly empty, as if he had taken something essential with him, leaving behind only the echo of what they had built together. The days that followed Ezra's departure were the longest of May's life, a special kind of torture that came from not knowing. The silence he left behind was a living thing, a hollow ache in the center of the house that followed her from room to room. She went through the motions of her life, tending the garden, mending the fences, feeding the chickens, but it all felt muted. The colors of her world leached away. Everything reminded her of him. The kitchen where they had talked late into the night, the porch swing where he had told her about his brother, the cellar door, sealed shut, but still carrying the weight of where it had all begun. She would find herself pausing in her work, listening for his soft footfalls on the floorboards, or turning to share a thought before remembering he was gone. The cellar door remained closed, but she was haunted by the memory of the man she had found there, and the king he had become, and the impossible thing that had grown between them in the darkness. She had no way of knowing what was happening in his world. No letters, no messages, just the terrible, gaping silence of waiting that stretched on and on. She didn't know if he was safe, if he was succeeding, or if he had been killed by his enemies the moment he returned. The thought was a cold knot of dread in her stomach that never fully loosened, a constant companion that woke her in the night, gasping from nightmares of him bleeding out on some distant throne room floor. She had sent him back to a world of shadow and intrigue. a world where he would have to be ruthless to survive. She tortured herself with images of him in battle, of him being hurt, of him being forced to become the monster her father had believed him to be, of the gentle man she had known being consumed by the necessities of power. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The summer heat settled over the farm, heavy and suffocating, making the silence even more oppressive. May worked until her muscles ached, trying to exhaust herself into a dreamless sleep each night. It rarely worked. Her dreams were filled with him, with the memory of his cold touch and the desperate heat of his kiss, with his voice saying her name like a prayer. One night, she couldn't bear the emptiness of the house any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating her with memories and absence. She took a lantern and descended into the cellar for the first time since he had left. The air was still and cold, smelling only of damp earth now, the scent of blood and suffering long since faded. The chains lay on the floor where she had left them, a coiled metal serpent that seemed to accuse her. She ran her fingers over the cold iron, over the silver runes that had held him captive, that had caused him so much pain, that had erased him from the world and left his brother to mourn. This was where it had all begun, in this dark, forgotten place, among the instruments of her father's cruelty. She had found a monster and had discovered a man. And she had, foolishly, impossibly, inevitably, fallen in love with him. The admission, even to herself in the darkness of the cellar, was a painful relief. It was the truth that had been hiding beneath her compassion, her sense of duty, her determination to be different from her father. She loved him. She loved his quiet strength, his ancient sorrow, the surprising gentleness he had shown her. She loved the way he listened, as if her words were precious, the way he looked at the moon as if seeing it for the first time. She loved the contradiction of him, the ruthless king and the man who wept at kindness. And she might never see him again. The thought was unbearable. A sob broke from her, the first she had allowed herself since he'd gone, and it opened a floodgate. She sank to the floor, the lantern casting a lonely circle of light around her, and wept for the vampire king who had stolen her quiet, ordinary heart and left her forever changed. It was another month later, as the first hints of autumn began to crisp the edges of the leaves and paint the world in shades of gold and amber, that he returned. He didn't arrive in a carriage of shadows with ceremony and fanfare. He simply walked up the dirt drive as the sun was setting, as if he were a neighbor returning from a long trip, as if 3 months hadn't passed since she'd watched him disappear into the night. He wore simple dark trousers and a linen shirt, nothing like the regal attire he'd left in. He looked tired, battle-weary, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of violence and sleepless days. But he was whole. He was here. May was on the porch, shelling peas into a metal bowl, the rhythmic motion one of the few things that could quiet her mind. The rhythmic plink, plink, plink of peas hitting metal stopped as she saw him, her hands going still as her brain struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. The bowl slipped from her lap, scattering green peas across the wooden planks in a cascade that neither of them noticed. She stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she felt dizzy, so hard she thought she might collapse. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his crimson eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He looked different. The weight of his crown, whether he was wearing it or not, had settled back onto his shoulders, changing his bearing, adding a gravity to his presence. But there was a new light in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Peace, perhaps, or resolution. Something settled and sure. Ezra, she breathed, and the sound of his name was half prayer, half sob. She flew down the steps, unable to hold herself back for even another second, and threw herself into his arms. He caught her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, burying his face in her hair as if he could memorize the scent of her, as if he had been starving for this and only this. He was real. He was here. The cold, solid feel of him was the most reassuring thing she had ever known. proof that he had survived, that he had come back to her as he promised. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest, afraid of the answer, but needing to know. Did you get your throne back?" He was silent for a moment, and in that silence she felt the world shift. He loosened his hold, taking her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks with a tenderness that made tears spring to her eyes. "The throne is Theron's," he said, his voice quiet but firm. May pulled back, confused, searching his face for answers. "What? But you said, your duty, the reckoning." "There was a reckoning," he said, and a grim shadow passed through his eyes, the shadow of violence done and justice served. "Those who conspired against me paid the price. I found who framed me, a rival vampire lord named Cassius, who had positioned himself as Theron's advisor. He sought to create chaos in my kingdom and war with humanity. He slaughtered Blackwood Creek himself and planted my ring to remove me from power." His voice went cold, hard as stone. "When I returned, he tried to kill me the moment I revealed myself. I executed him before the full court, with Theron as witness. It was the old way, necessary. My cousin also challenged me, refused to accept Theron's continued rule. I had to kill him too." He paused, his jaw tightening with remembered pain. "But the court is cleansed now. The conspirators are gone. The kingdom is secure." May stared at him, trying to understand, trying to process the violence he was describing so matter-of-factly. "But if you won, if you cleansed the court, why didn't you take back your throne?" "Because when I stood before my throne, when I saw Theron ruling with a compassion our people desperately needed, I saw what 3 years in the dark had shown me." His gaze was intense, burning into hers. "Power is a chain as binding as silver. I had spent 3 centuries wearing that crown, defining myself by it, believing it was my purpose, my destiny. But it was a prison as surely as your father's cellar was. Theron didn't want the crown when it was forced upon him, but he'd grown into it. He'd learned to rule with his heart as well as his head. The kingdom was stable, peaceful. He's a better king than I ever was, May. He rules with the kind of gentle strength that our people need after so much violence and loss." He looked into her eyes, his gaze utterly sincere, stripped of all royal pretense. "And I no longer wanted it. I declared Theron king in a formal conclave. It was not well received by the traditionalists. Some called it weakness, cowardice. Others called it abandonment." His voice dropped. "I had to kill 2 challengers who refused to accept it, who saw my abdication as an insult to our traditions. But I retained my title, King Emeritus. I can be called upon in times of crisis, but the day-to-day rule is Theron's. He's proven himself worthy, and I have proven that I am not my crown." May stared at him, and the enormity of what he was saying slowly sank in. "You gave it up," she whispered. "After everything, after fighting to reclaim it, you just walked away?" "I didn't give it up," he corrected gently, his hand still framing her face as if she were the most precious thing in all his long existence. "I simply chose something else. I chose freedom. I chose to be more than a function, more than a role. I chose to be just Ezra." His gaze swept over the familiar lines of the farmhouse, the fields stretching out into the twilight, and then settled back on her with such naked longing it stole her breath. "For 3 years in that cellar, I dreamed of my throne, of the power I had lost, of reclaiming what was mine. I thought it was what I wanted, what I needed to be whole again. But in the months I spent here, with you, I learned what it was to have a home, to have peace, to have someone who looked at me and saw not a king or a monster, but just a man." He took a shaking breath, and she saw the vulnerability in him, the fear that she might reject what he was offering. "When I was back in the heart of my kingdom, surrounded by the power and the politics and the endless darkness, Standing in the throne room where I had ruled for 3 centuries, I found that I no longer dreamed of my throne. I dreamed of this porch. I dreamed of the sound of your heart beating. I dreamed of your voice talking about soil and seasons and ordinary beautiful things. I dreamed of you, May. Only you. Tears welled in May's eyes, blurring his image, and she couldn't tell if they were tears of joy or disbelief, or the overwhelming relief of having him here, having him choose her. Ezra. I abdicated, he said, and the word sounded both strange and freeing on his lips, as if saying it aloud made it real. My brother rules. My kingdom is safe. I am free of the crown and the burden and the endless weight of being what everyone needed me to be. And I came back to you because this is where I belong. Not in a throne room. Here. He smiled then, a true, brilliant smile that lit up his entire face and made him look younger, unburdened, more alive than she had ever seen him. I have resources, properties in the mortal world held under various names for centuries. Investments, nothing extravagant, but enough to clear your debts and ensure the farm thrives. And I negotiated a settlement from the sanctum. He saw her confusion and explained. When Corvus presented evidence of the frame-up to the Hunter Council, they were horrified by your father's actions. The official story is that he acted alone, outside protocol. They've offered reparations, partially to avoid a war with my kind, partially because some of them have consciences. The money will arrive within the month. I don't want your money, she whispered, because that wasn't the point. That had never been the point. I know, he said, and his smile gentled, became tender. But I want to give it to you anyway. What I want to know, what I need to know, is if you will let me stay. Here, with you. Not as a king or a prisoner. Not as someone you're caring for out of duty or compassion, just as Ezra. Just as a man who wants to build a life with you, if you'll have him. The question was everything. The culmination of their entire journey, from the cellar to the throne room and back again. He wasn't offering her a place in his world, he was asking for a place in hers. He was offering her everything, his freedom, his future, his heart. She looked at him, at this ancient, powerful creature who had tasted absolute power and chosen absolute peace. Who had been shown the worst of humanity in that cellar and had been saved by the best of it, who was offering her his forever. A forever that would be spent not in a cold, dark castle, but here, in the warm, living light of her home. You think you can handle the quiet life? She asked, a teary smile breaking through. And she saw his answering smile, saw the hope blazing in his eyes. No court intrigue, no ancient feuds, just farming and seasons and ordinary days. I think, he said, leaning down to kiss her. A soft, tender kiss that was full of promise and devotion, and the kind of love that came from truly seeing another person and choosing them anyway. That I have had enough intrigue to last me several lifetimes. The only world I am interested in conquering now is this one. The only throne I want is beside you. She looked at him, at this impossible man who had turned her world upside down, who had taught her that mercy could be stronger than judgment, that seeing the person inside the monster was a kind of bravery all its own. He was offering her his forever, and she was just a mortal woman with a limited number of years. But somehow, that didn't seem to matter. What mattered was this moment, this choice, this man standing before her asking to be let in. You owe me nothing, you know, she said, her voice thick with emotion, because she needed him to understand that this had to be his choice, not his debt. Then let me spend an eternity giving you everything anyway, he murmured against her lips, and the words were a vow that settled into her bones. And she did. She let him stay. He bought the farm with his accumulated wealth, settling the debts that had been a constant shadow over her life, lifting the burden she had carried alone for so long. They never opened the cellar door again. They sealed it together one night, nailing boards across it and painting over the wood until it looked like just another part of the wall, leaving the chains and the memories to gather dust in the dark, acknowledging what had happened there, but choosing not to let it define them. He learned the rhythms of the farm, working alongside her in the cool of the night, his immortal strength making short work of the heavy tasks that had always taken her days. He learned the names of the constellations in her sky, and she learned the stories behind them from his ancient memory. He was a creature of the night, and she was a daughter of the day. But they found their life in the twilight, in the quiet moments between sunset and sunrise when both their worlds overlapped. His kingdom had a good king in Theron, one who ruled with compassion and wisdom. But May Holloway had Ezra. And in the end, in the quiet, unassuming farmhouse that had once been his prison, they had both, finally, come home. 6 months after Ezra's return, on the anniversary of the day she'd found him, May stood at the sealed cellar door. Ezra came to stand beside her, his presence a comfort and a strength. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked quietly. "Every day," he admitted, his voice soft. "Your father gave me 3 years of hell, but he also, inadvertently, gave me you. I don't know how to reconcile that. I don't know if I ever will." "Neither do I," she whispered, leaning into his solid, cold presence. "I think he would have hated what we've become. But I also think, somewhere in his rigid, broken heart, he might have understood that mercy can be stronger than judgment, that seeing the person inside the monster is its own kind of bravery." Ezra kissed the top of her head, his arms wrapping around her from behind. "Perhaps. Or perhaps some chains are meant to be broken, and some imprisonments are meant to free us both." They never opened the cellar door again, but they stopped seeing it as a tomb, stopped letting it haunt them. It was, in its strange way, a birthplace, the place where their impossible story had begun, where a lonely woman had found a dying king and had chosen kindness over fear, where mercy had won over judgment, where love had grown in the darkness and had brought them both into the light.